June 1944. A French resistance operative stands in an alley in Lyon, 10 meters from a German soldier conducting a routine street patrol. The operative holds what appears to be a crude metal box, approximately 5 inches long, stamped from sheet steel with visible welds and minimal finishing. It weighs less than a pound. It cost the United States government approximately $2 to manufacture. The operative points the device at the soldier's back and pulls the cocking knob. A spring-loaded striker releases, firing a single .45 caliber round at approximately 260 meters per second. The soldier falls. The operative opens the breech, extracts the spent casing with a wooden dowel stored in the grip, inserts a fresh cartridge from a small cardboard box, and walks away. The weapon that fired that shot was never designed to win battles. It was designed to be dropped by parachute in crates of 500, to be distributed to civilians who had never handled firearms, and to kill once at close range so that its user could acquire a proper weapon from the dead. It was called the FP-45 Liberator, and between July 1942 and August 1943, the United States manufactured 1 million of them in a program so controversial that it was classified for decades after the war ended. The Allied intelligence community in 1942 faced a resistance support problem that was logistical and strategic. Occupied populations across Europe and Asia required weapons to conduct sabotage and assassination operations against Axis forces. Conventional arms shipments were detectable, bulky, and required trained personnel to operate effectively. Parachute drops of rifles and submachine guns were intercepted frequently by the occupation forces. Manufacturing weapons locally in occupied territories was possible, but slow and dangerous. What resistance networks needed were weapons so simple that untrained civilians could use them, so cheap that they could be produced in massive quantities, so small that they could be hidden easily, and so disposable that losing them to enemy forces represented minimal tactical loss. The specification called for an essentially expendable weapon, a concept that contradicted every principle of conventional arms procurement and manufacturing. Development began in early 1942 at the request of the Office of Strategic Services. The Joint Psychological Warfare Committee wanted a weapon that could be mass-produced using simple manufacturing processes and distributed to resistance fighters in occupied territories. The design was assigned to the Inland Manufacturing Division of General Motors in Dayton, Ohio. The lead designer was Frederick Sampson, an automotive engineer with no prior firearms experience. This lack of a traditional gunsmithing background proved advantageous. Sampson approached the problem as an industrial designer rather than a weapons designer, prioritizing manufacturability and cost over performance, accuracy, or durability. The result was a single-shot pistol that could be stamped, welded, and assembled using techniques adapted from automobile body panel production. The weapon consisted of 23 components, all designed for maximum simplicity. The frame was stamped from 2 pieces of sheet steel and spot welded together. The barrel was a smooth-bore steel tube approximately 4 inches long pressed into the frame. There was no rifling. The firing mechanism used a spring-loaded striker released by pulling a cocking knob and pressing a trigger. The breech was a hinged section at the rear of the frame that opened to allow loading. The total length was 141 millimeters. The weight unloaded was approximately 450 grams. The weapon was chambered for the .45 ACP cartridge, chosen because it was a standard American military round and because its relatively low velocity meant a simple blowback action without requiring sophisticated locking mechanisms. Muzzle velocity with standard .45 ACP ammunition was approximately 260 meters per second, reduced from the cartridge's typical 285 meters per second due to the short barrel and lack of rifling. Accuracy was essentially non-existent beyond arm's length. The smooth bore meant the bullet tumbled unpredictably. The minimal sights, just a fixed front post and rear notch, were crude approximations. Effective range was optimistically listed as 7 meters, but practical combat range was under 3 meters. This was not a design flaw. This was design intent. The Liberator was meant to be pressed against an enemy soldier or fired from across a small room. At these distances, accuracy was irrelevant. What mattered was that the weapon fired reliably when the trigger was pulled and that it delivered a .45 caliber bullet with enough energy to incapacitate at contact distance. Both requirements were met adequately. Manufacturing began in June 1942. Inland Manufacturing retooled sections of its automotive production lines to produce Liberators. The entire weapon could be manufactured using 11 man-hours of labor, less time required to produce a single component of a conventional pistol. Production peaked at approximately 1,500 units per day. The weapons were packaged in cardboard boxes with 10 rounds of ammunition, a wooden dowel for extracting spent casings, and a comic strip instruction sheet showing loading, firing, and basic maintenance without text. The instructions assumed the user was illiterate or did not speak English. The entire package weighed less than 1 pound and measured approximately 6 inches by 4 inches, small enough to be concealed in clothing or hidden in building walls. Operational deployment was immediate and problematic. The first shipments, totaling approximately 500,000 units, were prepared for distribution to Chinese resistance forces fighting Japanese occupation. These weapons never reached China in significant quantities. The nationalist Chinese government objected to arming civilians, preferring that weapons go to regular military units. The OSS diverted most shipments to storage. Approximately 50,000 Liberators were dropped over France in 1943 and early 1944. Fewer than 25,000 reached resistance networks. Many were recovered by German forces or lost during parachute drops. French resistance groups that received the weapons had mixed reactions. Some units valued them as better than nothing. Other groups considered them nearly useless and requested proper firearms instead. The weapon's limitations in practice exceeded even the modest expectations. The single-shot capacity meant missing or wounding rather than killing left the user defenseless. Reloading required approximately 10 seconds under ideal conditions, longer under stress. The ejection process, using a wooden dowel to manually push out the spent casing, was awkward and required fine motor control that degraded under combat stress. The smooth bore meant bullets could strike sideways, reducing penetration and stopping power. The stamped steel construction was fragile. Weapons dropped onto hard surfaces or subjected to rough handling often suffered bent frames or damaged firing pins. Quality control was minimal. Some weapons arrived with components that did not fit properly or springs that failed after a few shots. Comparison with other improvised resistance weapons reveals the Liberator's unique position. The British well rod was substantially more sophisticated and expensive, but genuinely useful. The Polish resistance manufactured various improvised firearms, but these required machine shops and skilled labor. The Soviet PPS submachine gun could be produced quickly, but still required conventional manufacturing facilities. The Liberator was unique in being designed from inception as a disposable item rather than a durable weapon. This philosophy was controversial even within Allied military planning. Many officers argued that resources spent on Liberators would be better allocated to conventional weapons. The counter-argument, never fully validated, was that psychological impact and quantity would offset individual weapon inadequacy. Actual combat use statistics are impossible to establish. Resistance organizations rarely documented specific weapons used in operations. German occupation forces mentioned recovering small American pistols in various reports, but provided no systematic analysis. Post-war interviews with resistance members produced conflicting accounts. Some claimed Liberators were effective for specific assassination missions. Others reported that the weapons were considered so poor that they were never deployed operationally. The truth likely falls between extremes. Some Liberators were used successfully. Many were never used at all. The weapon's reputation exceeded its actual battlefield impact. The psychological warfare aspect was perhaps more significant than the military utility. The Liberator was intended to convince occupied populations that Allied support was real and that resistance was possible. The fact that 1 million weapons were manufactured suggested Allied commitment to liberation. The fact that they were single-shot pistols of questionable effectiveness suggested something less reassuring. German propaganda seized on captured liberators as evidence of Allied desperation or incompetence. Whether the weapons boosted or undermined resistance morale depends on which post-war accounts one prioritizes. Production ceased in August 1943 after 1 million units were completed. Approximately 500,000 remained in storage when the war ended. These were systematically destroyed in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The program was classified until 1964, when declassification revealed details of manufacture and distribution. The controversy surrounding the Liberator continued in historical analysis. Some scholars argue that it represented innovative thinking about unconventional warfare. Others contend it was a waste of resources that could have been better allocated to conventional weapons production. The truth, as with most wartime programs, resists simple categorization. The German soldier in Lyon who was killed by a Liberator in June 1944, if indeed such a specific incident occurred, was one of perhaps a few hundred casualties attributable to the weapon across all theaters. The 1 million Liberators manufactured represent 1 million instances of industrial capacity diverted to a weapon that saw minimal combat use and generated maximum controversy. The French resistance operative who fired that shot, if he existed, likely discarded the Liberator after firing and sought a proper weapon, exactly as the weapon's designers intended. The Liberator succeeded in being cheap, simple, and mass-producible. It failed in being particularly useful. Whether these outcomes justify the program's existence remains debated among military historians 70 years after the fact, and the weapon that was meant to terrify occupying armies became instead a footnote to a larger conversation about the ethics and effectiveness of arming civilian populations for asymmetric warfare instead.